Welcome back to Finding the Edge podcast. I'm Garrett Boyum, joined with Kyle Dupick. And today we're going to attempt to try to cover the basics of ecological dynamics. That's been a theme or something that, looking back at the history of this podcast, I don't think there's been an episode where we've really covered the basics. So that's the hope, that's the goal for today. But I do want to at least start out with just going over like how things are going. So, Kyle, how have things been for you like this week? What have you been working on? What have you been working through? Things at practice, etc.
Yeah, we've been, what are we in? About week plus, I guess it would just be, into our official practice, and lots of live bullpens with guys facing live hitters, kind of getting them on a more regular schedule so that we can prepare them, ramping up starters, starting to get into here even now, like maybe 2 times a week for a reliever. That might be a little bit more of what they'll face here in the coming weeks and during the season. And then even just trying to guide intentions within those live bullpens so that they're not just facing a hitter, but we've had several guys who are working on new pitches. And so we'll search for places to use those, try to set up guiding intentions essentially for each live session so that the guy can actually work on things, get people out in different ways, increase their repertoire. That's been probably the coolest thing is the guys who are having the most success right now are guys who have actually added pitches to their repertoire rather than people who have zoomed it in more, which is the opposite of honestly what I thought. In the fall, we really explored a lot and it was very wide. Like how many different types of pitches could we explore and see if any of them fit you a little bit better in the way that you throw and maybe pronation, supination bias, how they feel, etc. And I thought we would zoom that down more, but I've still got some guys who are actually creating new shapes and then immediately 2 days later taking them into the live and having a lot of success. And the number one comment is always like, well, I didn't have pitch X and Y, so I was able to go to pitch Z today and get a few outs. And so it's challenged my assumptions again that we needed to narrow at this point, but instead we can continue to use these live bullpens as places to open up, their options and their toolbox.
I know we were just talking offline about this, but you guys have been, your hitters and pitchers have been kind of facing each other more frequently. What has that been like, trying to have your guys throw to hitters more? Also, I guess, are you guys practicing consistently now, or is it you're still kind of in your, I don't know, off season or whatever dates where you have X number of dates and you guys have rolled over some of those dates from the fall into the spring? Or are you now full into full spring practice now? I suppose it is after February 1st, but I don't know how have the new rules in D3 affected how you guys do your practice design?
Our first official week would have been last Monday. And so the NCAA allowed us contact days. I think they expanded it, if I'm not mistaken, to the number of 24, but they gave us more freedom about when we could use those. So we used, for 2 weeks, we used just a handful of days each week, and then started kind of like on Monday, on this past, would have been a week ago today. And so we had 2 weeks where we had 3 days a week, and we just got everybody about 20 or, I think it was 20. Yeah, it was 20 pitches each week. We had 30 guys to get through. So that's what we focused on there. And now we're starting to ramp the guys up, like I said. So 1 full week of practice. Tomorrow, I guess, would be our official week 2 of practice. We have, would be, if you count this week, 3 more weeks till our first weekend game. So 4 weeks of practice and then about 2 weeks of what you'd call sort of contact days where we were just meeting a few times a week.
And so for you guys, what was the kind of the process to build guys up and mitigate injuries, right? I think the standard practice, and which is what we do, is, okay, we put guys on a throwing program, we build up their volume, through catch, play, and long toss. No weighted balls, anything beyond plyo work. And then we build them up and then we get them on the mound kind of around the time they get back. Start with like a 15, 20 pitch set, and that's once a week. And our first week we did all fastballs. That was our first week. Now, second week, guys got added an extra inning. So now maybe it's like up to like 30 to 40 pitches. Guys threw 2 sets. And so we split that out across 2 days. And then now we're in week 3 and we're about to split that across 3 days because of the number of pitchers we have. We don't have 30 pitchers. We got maybe 18, 20 guys, I think, is somewhere around the number of pitchers we have. And so I guess for us, it means like our hitters are going to see pitchers 3 days in a row, which I think is good. I like that. But I guess I'm curious, how are you guys able to schedule it out? What's your process of making sure guys, one, stay healthy, and then 2, how do you navigate that staying healthy and then the consistency of that pitcher batter interaction?
Yeah. The healthy piece, we had meetings with every guy at the end of fall and just talked about goals, set plans, had them create like an ideal plan, and then kind of follow up with almost like a revised plan. Nothing that we can obviously legally hold them to, but just trying to give them a vision for what they wanted to work on. And we kind of tried to divide it a little bit in terms of like, I think the language we used was skills and abilities, but don't quote me on that. But basically it was like kind of that idea of like actually getting better at the game versus like, what are some of those raw abilities that you have? And, that might be a place to chase those a little bit. If a kid wanted a velo bump, it's probably not while we're throwing live during fall. It's probably going to happen in that winter session or in the summer. And so guys kind of went away with that. And we were just very clear. Hey, when you get back, we have a contact day on this day and we are throwing live. You better be ready for 20 pitches. And so I think the benefit of it was that we had 2 weeks of that where guys were just throwing 20 live pitches once a week. And so you kind of got a very small dose of it. And I even had one young man who said, are we going to get more that next week? Because he had thrown, I think, 50 pitches live to hitters back at his facility. That's something I'm really thankful. Many of our players, we encourage them, go throw live when you're at home. We've already been doing it in the fall. Have it be a touch point for what you're working on so that you can build your bullpens where don't have a live hitter around what actually happened in the interaction with the batter. And had a lot of guys that took ownership of that. We definitely, I've noticed some guys have, dealt with it better and worse in terms of as we've ramped them up. That some guys where we've pushed to 30 and 40, but right now we're actually only expanding it a little bit based on role. So if you're a long relief guy, you'll probably get a couple sets. We haven't been doing innings. Head coach has just been so good. Like basically everything I asked for, he makes it work. And one of those things that we were like pushing him for was, I think we need to do it by pitches, not by innings, right? Because you might have an efficient 7-pitch inning, but that doesn't help that guy get to the number that we would like him to get to. So we've just kind of set the number as a set is 20 pitches. And we'll give a guy 1.5 sets or 2 sets. So our long relievers now are getting about 2 sets at about 40 pitches. Our starters, I think we're up to 60 in this week too. So they would have gone 20, 20, 40 or 50-ish. And now they're at 60. Next week, we'll give them an extra set and we'll kind of push them to that 70 to 80 range. We haven't had any problems with them. Some of our relievers it's barked at them after 40 pitches, but the way we've kind of done it, we during those contact days, we practice really 3 key components. Like, what's your live day look like? What's your recovery day look like after a live day? And what's your day before a live day look like? We really wanted to hone that in. And then what we've added now is we've just called them training days. And so we'll have maybe training low, moderate, or high. Are you a starter? And so you can have more wave loading there, or are you more of a reliever? And then how much work can you do? And we've really tried to encourage guys, like, obviously listen to your arm, communicate with us. We've had some guys who have had pain and we've had to work through that. I don't know that I could connect the dots yet on any of those guys that it was definitely because of live. In fact, one of them, I know it wasn't. He's coming back from an elbow injury. One of them it might be, but like we've only really had 3 guys whose arm have barked enough at them that they've had to sit out of our, I guess it'd be 29 guys we have now. So 3 out of our 29. So I think that's been really helpful because we kind of basically we have this big old chart and we line up here's your live day. And so we know this is your day before, this is your recovery, and then we'll sprinkle in training days. But then we try to get feedback from them too. I mean, I have some guys who will throw a live session of 20 or 40 pitches. The next day they'll want to do a heavy training day because they'll feel great. And I go, I'm fine with that. Just as long as we do recover at some point, right? We just can't do that over and over. And so I'm really trying to teach and help the guys. And so far it's been good in that vein. I think sometimes it makes me nervous, but ultimately I'm trying to listen to the pitchers and allow them to listen to themselves. And I think they've really taken ownership of that. A number of our meetings, that's what we're constantly presenting, is like you being your own best coach and knowing, letting us kind of come be a guide alongside of you instead of the one who tells you this is how many sets and reps. I had a young man ask me today who was one of the injured ones, like, hey, how many reps should I do? And I joked with him, like, I was like, the first thing I told you guys that I don't like that, right? I don't like sets and reps because I don't know. I don't know. Did you not throw it all during the winter? And now I'm seeing you. Then your reps are going to look different than the guy who just told me that he threw a 50 pitch live bullpen and now I'm bumping him down to 20, So those are going to be two different guys and they're going to define that better. So I would say by and large, we've had good process with the health stuff. And I think a big part of that is the wave loading of the days. And we've been also training like glove side, arm side. So on a recovery day, it's very light. You're not doing much. But on a live day, you're going to train your arm side after you throw. We're just going to bang it up. And on your day before, we're going to train glove side because as far as I can tell, there's some neurological benefits to training the opposite limb from people who've been injured. And so we've been chasing after that. And so maybe that has something
Okay,
to do
so
with
I
it.
want you to clarify something there. Okay,
Yeah.
because when I first heard arm side, glove side, I was thinking location of the plate you're throwing to.
Yeah, good call.
But
Yeah.
you just kind of pointed out that that's not what you're doing. You want to be a little bit more explicit for some people who might be thinking that your guys are working block practice there of throwing pitches to certain sides of the plate.
Yeah, so arm side, glove side will be what arm they're training in their post throw. And so if it's a live day, we'll have various exercises that they're doing for protecting their elbow, for ER/IR, for long lever, scaption and decel, acel, decel, like both sides, just trying to do different exercises every day. All those things are dictated by, we do use the arm care platform. I've appreciated it from just the ability to better understand from a strength perspective if they're fatigued in certain ways. And so they won't always do the full reps. It will be dictated by how much strength they have and are they super fatigued. So that's one place we'll use it, as well as just how they're feeling that day. And so on live days, they'll train their arm side. And then days before they're live, they'll train their glove side. So it's in a sense, it's very much like a recovery day. But there's been some studies on people who've blown up their knee or UCL surgeries, and one group won't train the opposite limb and the other group will. And you'll see drastic strength differences when that person comes and they're able to actually start doing some of their rehab. And so I don't know if it's exactly doing anything, but I'm trusting that process right now. I think just those little pieces, listening to the player, having these wave days that allow them to listen to their arm, while also not. At some point, you have to train your arm, right? Like at some point, you have to do something to help your arm stay healthy from an arm care standpoint. And you've talked about this a lot with how arm stuff, like how stagnant it can become. It's the same thing over and over. And so we might be doing a bicep or forearm or ER exercise, but we've tried to acknowledge how many different ways you can do that. There's a million different exercises. You can change it every day. You can change the band and the tension and how you're doing it. And so I think those two things I'm hoping have really helped guys with the arm health piece of it, that we're not ignoring the arm care. We're really hammering it out, but we're doing it all on that live day so that then you recover the next day. And the day after that, you're going to do some more glove side. So you actually almost have like 2 days of recovery where you're not actually training your arm side big time. And so I think it's allowing it to get a spike of training while also giving it some recovery. So that's where I'm currently at with post throw. Lord knows those things change all the time because they're tough. You're trying to figure out what works, but that's where I currently land with it.
Okay. One other element too, because I know you had talked about this in the fall, your guys throwing to your pitchers throwing to hitters every day. So I could see that working in your circumstance because you didn't see them every day. So every day you practice, your pitchers were throwing against hitters. But now that you're seeing them every single day, are are you basically it's not the same pitcher every single day or every
Yep.
pitcher throwing every single day to hitters, but rather you have a group of pitchers every
Mm-hmm.
single day throwing to hitters. Is that what you're doing currently, or is it more like the traditional, like what we were doing? Because actually, to your point, like we're not doing innings. I just said innings because that just, I don't know, just how my
Makes
brain
sense.
thinks
Yeah.
about it. But it's basically sets. Like we have a pitch cap, and if guys go really fast, they can, and they collect 3 outs. We might let them go 5 or 6, depending upon when they hit their limit. Then they're done for their set, and they'll come back. But okay, we basically end load it, meaning Thursday through Saturday is when we do all our live stuff, which I think is pretty traditional, where you have like other days where you're doing different sort of training. Now, personally, if I could have it go the way that I want, I would have pitchers throwing to hitters all the time. I wouldn't do it separate the way it currently is, but that requires logistics and everybody to be on the same page. And so, and you know, and so I guess since you're the pitching coach, how have you structured it? Is it guys only get on the mound and face hitters individually once a week, or are they able to get on the bump and face hitters and interact with hitters more than once a week? How is your current structure, and how are you thinking about it currently? And is it different from the fall to the spring?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, different from the fall. Fall, we would have been Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, and you would just face a live hitter every day at a lower intensity if it wasn't the more scrimmage-oriented environment. As we talked, with constraints as a coach, we actually currently have an indoor batting cage that isn't fixed, and so we only have one cage instead of 2 on our indoor facility, where we do all of our practice. And so we were able to get outside. Would have been Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and then today, Sunday. And so we got outside our last 4 days of practice. And so what we've done is, if we have 5 days of practice and then we kind of have like an individual work day, our indoor facility has a ton of track meets now. So our Fridays are much more difficult to get in there unless you can get in there before 10 a.m. And that's just not realistic with classes. So we've taken those 5 days, we've broken them down into 3 scrimmage days. Where you'll do some sort of, we call it gameplay. If we're outside, we'll do more of a scrimmage oriented. And then we've just called them exploratory lives for the other 2 days. And on those days, that's where it's going to be less scrimmage like. The hitters are actually being encouraged now as well to explore different solutions, like rather than just, hey, what's my zone and what's the damage I'm doing? A little bit more of a sparring mindset. The coaching staff has been really open to that. Which I've appreciated. It allows our pitchers to go in there with a little less stress and pressure. But to answer your first question there, yes, guys are only now throwing to guys, to hitters. Pitchers are only throwing to hitters in their live 100% effort days. I think part of that at this point is certainly the constraints as a coach, right? Just as you acknowledged, when can we have facilities? What time do we have? We have 29 pitchers to get through. We've been lucky enough that we got our first 2 weeks of schedule, and we're getting everybody set still, which is good. So then, the logical question is, what are they doing on those off days? We're trying to group our guys in groups of 4 so that every bullpen that you throw, it isn't always perfect. You'll walk into our practice and you'll have one pitcher throwing to another pitcher who's down and there's nobody else there. But we try to put our guys in 4s so that there's always a batter and an umpire. And we try to give them guiding intentions. Just had a meeting on Sunday about, like, if I give you a guiding intention, how might you use that to then create different types of variability within. I'm working on a cutter, gyro, slider back and forth today. Okay, so how might I do that? If I give you that guiding intention and we're not necessarily there because we're over at the scrimmage or we don't have somebody, how might you do that? So we're trying to communicate that with our guys to do just better bullpens that are more problem solving based, instead of just, I'm working on my curveball. I'm working on that today, without clear goals on what we're trying to do with the shape or the behavior of the batter, things like that. And so I think That's a big goal. And even like if I have to, I'll stand in. And I did it today and actually got totally drilled in the knee, and I have a huge egg on it. But like that's honestly, the young man apologized, but it's like it's part of the job. Like you need to have a hitter in there, and even just the other day, I stepped in for one of our young men, and like he was working on a slider, and I just said, hey, I'd like for you to look at where I'm at in the box, and then I want you to throw a slider that you think would be useful based on where I'm at. And so I might crowd it as a lefty, or I'd give him more space, and then I'd go to a righty and I'd do the same thing. And I was just trying to get him to connect to, like, if I'm way away from the plate, where might I throw that slider? If I'm on top of it, where might I throw it? And it was fun to see him try to connect to those information, because trying to give our guys more freedom as well. So, yes, our bullpens would now look much more traditional if you're not on a live day, but still trying to, within the nuances of it, make it a little bit more alive, a little bit more representative, a little bit more problem solving based.
One, two, like, here's my thought on the whole having a batter. It's like, if I don't have someone to stand in, I have always used something. So what I mean by that is I usually can find a garbage can.
Yep.
Garbage cans in facilities, on campuses tend to be big, and they tend to be tall, either tall or big. And so I've used that. I've used ball carts. I think in general, unless you're just in a field and there's literally nothing out there, you generally can find something. And so at least my thought is that if you at least know, because this is the thing of, I think maybe this is a good time to start to transition towards, okay, what are the basics of ecological dynamics?
Yep.
Because one of them, is, okay, so if we're talking about, okay, man, I want to break it down yet, but all right, let's make this point before we start trying to break it down here, is that, okay, from an ecological perspective, perception shapes action. And so when you start to put different things within your practice task environment, it's going to change your action. And what that entails specifically is your mechanics. Your mechanics are going to start to shift and change based upon the perceptual information that you're picking up. And so when you put a batter in there, it's going to start to change how much, like, your feel of where you can throw pitches, what your action capabilities are going to start to shift once you start putting different things and how. And this is where, again, a trash can is not ideal, because a person's body and how it looms over the plate, how it is standing relative to the plate, your torso, the bat, all this sort of stuff, your head, your legs, your knees, all these sort of things will create a different feel. And so this is why, yes, we've talked, we sent out a text tonight, or a message tonight to all the hitters, like, hey, pitchers are throwing pens in the morning. Hitters, we love stand-ins. I don't know that many guys take it that serious and will go stand in, because honestly, it's, from what I learned when I did a little bit of swing dance, you learn how to swing dance better when you have different, you practice with different partners, because all of a sudden you have to become more sensitive to people who don't, because it teaches you how to lead. Because if you dance with the same partner all the time, they know where you want them to go. You don't have to lead them very well. Whereas if you end up working with somebody else, you begin to actually learn how to truly lead. And so anyways, where I'm going with this, if, like, when you vary up who's standing there, it's going to vary up the different perceptions and the different feels. And so, like, to me, that's where that is so necessary if you want to work on command. Because the big thing, as we start to get into, like, the basics of ecological dynamics, is that the big thing, and this is why I think it matters a ton, and the concepts from ecological dynamics matter a lot, is that really the big thing that it all comes back to is the transfer of your training. Okay, so if you see success in the practice setting, you would therefore assume that you're going to see success in the game. That's the whole point of, like, why we do everything. But what ecological dynamics starts to say is there are certain conditions under which transfer is more likely to happen than others. And I'm going to say more likely because there's the things that are going to transfer basically is, like, the situation and the environment, the context, everything being the same, that's going to have the highest amount of transfer. And the other thing that ecological dynamics is also going to posit is that no two situations are the same. There's always some sort of difference and variation. So therefore, really, the only time where the conditions start to be really more or less the same is in a laboratory where you can sterilize it and basically try to recreate all the same conditions. And you begin to see, even in practice, when you don't vary the conditions very much and you have very low variability, how fast guys tend to be able to converge on functional solutions and all that sort of stuff. But then the question becomes, as you jump it up the next level, okay, how well does that go? Then that process starts all over again. And so then it becomes a question of like, okay, how long does it take me to build up from something that's super scaled down to build up to something that's complex? And in my mind, that process is way too long and it takes way too much time. And so an ecological approach presents some other ways of potentially getting to that place where you might not actually need to spend all this time going through all these steps to get to basically try to, work from like point A to point B to point C and all the way up to point Z being the game. Instead, there's other ways of doing it so that the transition is a lot smoother and a lot quicker. Like, for example, right now, I'm pleasantly surprised at how well our hitters are doing right now. And we did not have a great offensive fall. And yeah, so one of the fundamental tenets of ecological dynamics is that things are nonlinear. Okay. And so because of that, there wasn't like this natural progression of watching them get better every day in and day out. Some guys had something that would click and that is kind of carried over, or that would decay, but I've seen some guys have some stickiness. Like one guy who came in as a lefty, played up north, not great competition, short porch out to left, hit absolute just nukes in high school, and just really kind of struggled in the fall. And we were really worried about him like not really contributing at all. And there was one moment that kind of clicked for him of like kind of getting him to start in his legs a little bit earlier. And that seemed to like get his exit velos to cluster at his top end. That was cool, all that sort of stuff. And then it kind of seemed to go away and it seemed like he was kind of struggling. But now, like even since we've started lives, he's had, I think, every week good quality contact or finding ways to get hits. And so it's looking like he should make the lineup early in the spring. And and when we were talking in the fall, it was like, I don't know, the head coach was kind of like not very certain or whatever, but I think he's now building a case. And so what I'm seeing across the board though, with all the hitters, at least today, like guys are hitting, even though it was off the machine, guys are squaring balls up a lot more frequently. Yeah, okay, some of the velo, all this sort of stuff plays a role, but like guys who have been struggling, or everybody seems to be able to start to square up the ball more, and it's happening more frequently. And so what I was trying to emphasize to the hitters today is that today was a weighted bat day. And I did not tell them, I did not lay out a specific program for them. I did that in the fall or in the off season. But right now I more just wanted to, because we're going to get into the phase of the season very shortly where we're going to start playing a lot and there's not going to be any structured stuff. And so when guys are going to go work on their own, I wanted to lay out some principles for them of like how to utilize these things and why they should use them and all this sort of stuff. And so I pretty much left it on them to utilize these things. But the idea here is that when we do stuff that is more variable, guys are able to converge on solutions, and their solutions are also more flexible. And so anyways, that's what I've been seeing is like this stuff seems to, I don't know yet because we haven't played any games yet. We haven't gotten outside, and we'll start to see once we get outside and against competition. Because actually the interesting thing to me is one of our top players, the most talented kid on the team right now, is actually, he isn't having as much success right now. He had a day where he went 0 and all this sort of stuff and like just, swinging and missing a lot. And so he is more resistant to doing this variable type of training. He's more resistant to it. And I think that kind of points to the fact of the guys that have tried this a little bit more, you start to see like there's just a lot more consistency and are taking to the message. For us, the big thing that I've been preaching to them is being able to make adjustments in three swings. And so like this whole off season, I was really trying to help them pick up on information and trying to figure out how to connect their movement to being able to make adjustments. Because that's, to me, okay, so one of the big ideas of ecological dynamics is the idea of an athlete as a problem, or rather the whole human movement system as a problem-solving system. And so really trying to lean into that with them. And I don't know yet if they fully get it yet, because there's so much of the traditional approach that they are inundated with outside of, the little bit that they work with me. And so I guess for me, that's been a challenge. But anyways, that's kind of besides the point. So
I think it's a good point in terms of variability, variability
right.
of Rob Gray just, tweeted out his journal article that's coming out where they had studied a couple people with hitters. That is, one group doing a more traditional approach of training, trying to hit a line drive, getting some more traditional cues, and another group doing what he called undesired outcomes training, where you try to like hit the ball foul and straight down and straight up and in every conceivable way in their virtual environment reality that they built for them. The undesired outcomes group performed better. And when I asked Rob about it in a Zoom later, he was studying people with less than 5 years of experience. So he did acknowledge, it seemed like that was geared towards more novices, kind of challenging the traditional status quo. Let's train the right way to do it over and over. But he acknowledged that, in his work with the professional players, training desired outcomes, variability with that would probably be better. And so for us, even exactly, what you're saying is, I think that's a big piece. So we talked to our guys just today about like, hey, if you're learning a new pitch, it might be better to work on some undesired outcomes, because you are going to yank that slider sometimes. Or we'll have guys go back and watch their video from their lives, and had one young man like chart where were your misses clustered. Okay, can then we just go build a bullpen around that, so that you can learn how to solve that problem, rather than doing the same thing over and over again. Whereas if you already have a skill built, maybe it would be better to have the ability to work on the desired outcomes over and over a little bit more, if that makes sense.
Maybe.
Instead of trying to do the like if a guy's learning a brand new curveball, better to work on the undesired outcomes, bouncing it, hanging it, yanking it, hitting a guy. Whereas it doesn't mean you only do that, but was guiding like, oh, if your best pitch is your sweeper, then maybe you could work on desired outcomes, backdooring it to a guy, throwing a back foot one, stealing a strike, creating a smaller pitch, creating a bigger shape or a more depth or horizontal movement. And so, which kind of makes sense in terms of like, oftentimes when guys get really skilled, they make mistakes less, but they're able to be really variable within the solution space, the good solution space. And so I think the variability that you're talking about there is really important to apply, because ultimately you're going to face problems that are hard to solve in the game. And if you've never learned to adjust or adapt those when you're starting to make, if I'm late on a pitch, how do I fix that problem? Well, if I never practice that, it would make sense that it would be really hard in my 3 or 4 at-bats when I'm only going to see a few pitches to hit, that I could solve that problem more quickly, to your point, trying to make that adjustment in 3 pitches or less.
Well, and the other thing too, to your point there of like, okay, if you've never tried to figure out how to solve that problem of being late, like where do you start? You know what I mean? If this is the first time it's ever happening to you or whatever, somebody brings it to you, you're like, okay, so what do I do? If you just simply say to a player, which I mean, I've heard it said, be on time. Okay, what does that mean?
No.
Or don't be late, whatever it is. Like, what is that? You're late. Okay, so what do you do? Like, and so I've initially first though, I think, and actually I should just bring this tweet up. I mean, this is relevant here. I don't think we're going to, and ultimately, for the listeners, we'll see whether or not we get to something that's like cohesive of like about EcoD and what it is and the basics. It just might be sprinkled in here, and you're going to have to pull out the nuggets. But let's see here. Where is that? Where's this Twitter thread? I thought this was a great Twitter thread, and actually, honestly, it touches on all the things that we've been communicating back and forth. So it's kind of funny. Okay, and so in here, Bobby Tewksbury and Steve Johnson. Steve Johnson is a really, really good hitting coach, and he is talking about like, okay, should we be telling the athlete? There's this conversation that's going on between him and Bobby, and maybe I'll pin it in the description. But they're kind of talking about feels and also like coaches telling other players like how they should hit, and how oftentimes that can be really difficult. And I mean we can talk about motor preferences if we want here, because this is also something that I was thinking about and I want to discuss as well. Because I think what's his name? What's his first name? Do you know what his name is? What's this?
I don't. Actually,
I feel like I should know it.
Yeah,
is it Matt or Swoop?
Matt Swope,
or at least his
maybe?
last name. Swope? How do you pronounce it?
Matt. I think it's Matt.
Matt. Yeah. Okay. So Matt brings up a good point of, we may be trying to get an athlete to do something that their body isn't necessarily in a position to really do. Okay. And this has come up with things like on base U and other philosophies. I don't know if that's the right word, but other systems, that are out there have talked about how, okay, if a person doesn't have, a ton of hip internal rotation, then having them like aggressively counter rotate into their back hip might not work so well for them, because they just don't have the range of motion to get into that back hip. You can pick any sort of thing like T-spine rotation, whatever it is. Okay. So you're going to have these sort of like biomechanical or physical limitations just based upon the available degrees of freedom of the system. And I think he brings up a good point with that. And I know his system, motor preferences system, is set up a little bit different. It doesn't completely think about those things in those terms, but in my mind, that's what it's touching on. And so what's I think a little bit what Steve is trying to point out here is it gets, in a way, motor preferences seems to try to also be top down while also trying to be bottom up at the same time. Or really, I think what Matt's system of motor preferences is actually pointing to is trying to individualize, right? That whole idea that when I was at Cressy Performance, Cressy, I think, was one of the first to really push the idea of individualization. And so I think really what motor preferences is trying to do is trying to individualize training and how to interact with an athlete, which I think is good. Mm-hmm. But it still feels like, because their thing is like, I'm trying to identify what you're good at, and then we're going to basically, in my opinion, put you in a box and basically say that, okay, this is all you should ever do. And to me, that's too restrictive. And I think
wouldn't it be,
go ahead.
Well, just to use a term, if we're talking about EcoD basics, to use a term that when I actually had to ask you what it meant, organismic asymmetry, right? I read that and I went, what the heck does that mean? But that feels a little bit like what motor preferences is doing at times. They're looking at the organism, right, but they're not looking at the environment that's causing the movements that they say terrestrial or aerial. I think there's a lot of great things. I'm reading their book right now. I'm trying to glean what I can, but I think that that's an EcoD basic, which is we are trying to figure out why the athlete is moving the way they are in the environment that they're embedded in. And that's a really key principle.
Yeah. And to kind of build out that a little bit further. So one, okay, the asymmetry, what was the word? I mean, I can
organismic asymmetry is what I came. So you're looking at the athlete or the organism rather than the athlete organism environment system that is interacting together. Right.
And so, I mean, I'll just flip over to this. No, is it this one? No, this one. Okay. So one of the main key concepts of ecological dynamics, and this is pulled. So ecological dynamics is, we're going to veer off track here but that's all right. This is nonlinear. So we're being very ecological here, so bear with us. Okay. So ecological dynamics is actually it's two disciplines merged together. So you have ecological psychology and dynamic systems theory, and their key concepts are kind of being brought together here, and that's what ecological dynamics is. Like in general, like these, it's pulling from these two main disciplines. And so one of the main core tenets of ecological psychology is the organism-environment relationship, and that these two things are, well, one, this is the proper unit or proper level of analysis. All when you go to analyze and think about your athlete and and about, like, I guess you could say, athletic behavior, athletic movement, you need to be thinking about it in terms of how the athlete and the environment and the interactions between those two things. And so that is one of the fundamental things that makes ecological dynamics different, is that this is the primary way that those who are utilizing an ecological approach are thinking about sport performance and the development of sport performance, is that there is a mutual reciprocal relationship between the athlete and the environment around them. And these two things are constantly influencing each other. So the athlete influences the environment and the environment influences the athlete. And so when Kyle was bringing up the fact that there's this asymmetry between the organism and the environment, the majority of coaching, traditional coaching, focuses on the athlete or the organism, so much so that it forgets or will throw in at the end the environment. And what ecological dynamics, the way that it is thinking about things, is that actually we cannot separate those two things. Those two things should always be kept together. And so, and also, like, this whole thing of, like, when is an athlete never in an environment? And so basically this is just a different way of thinking about things. And I think at the end of the day, how this comes back to, of, like, again, I've mentioned this so many times on this podcast, of, like, why ecological dynamics, why am I so passionate about it, is because for me as a coach, I'm always I want things to transfer. And everything that I've done in the past was always with the thought that this is going to make them a better player on the field. And so I hope this clicks for people, of, like, when, like, thinking about the athlete and the environment together just makes way more sense for things transferring, and to have things transfer and to better help the athlete. And so, at least for me, that's why I want to, like, kind of hammer this point here. But anyway, so that's what's being said when we're talking about this asymmetry, this using this technical jargon. But really, it's just the fact that there's an overemphasis on the athlete at the exclusion of the environment and the context. And I think when I look at social media now, I do think that by and large, most people understand that context is important, but their behavior in terms of how they go about coaching does not seem to demonstrate that they truly believe that, because the environments that they create don't lack the context. And this comes back to the fact that if you want things to transfer, you need the context to also be there. Or rather, when we go back to perception and action, well, some big key core concepts when it comes to perception and action is the ability, or this idea of attunement, and attuning to specifying information. Okay, so the athlete is going to couple their movement to information. But if the information that they're coupling their movement to is not present, or is different than what is present in the game, how are they supposed to be sensitive and find that information and connect to that information if it's not present in your practice environments? I mean, because to me, like, okay, let's use this example from my time when I first started coaching at the junior college level. We had a kid from the Dominican. He had a ton of pop, all this sort of stuff. Nice, big, strong kid. And when you put him in the game, it looked like he had never been there. And he would mash flips. Absolute, just crush flips. You put him against a pitcher and it looked like he had zero clue what the heck was going on. And so I just kind of like, to me, that is a perfect example of like the specifying information was not, there was not enough specifying information present in the environments that he practiced in that allowed him to transfer that to the game. And so I think in general, the baseball community is better, but I still think there's ways to go because there's still this pushback against these ideas of like, nah, intent is king and whatever. And I mean, we can get into that. Intent is also a big part of ecological dynamics and like perception and action. And if we want to talk about the constraint-led approach, like intention is a huge component. And there's this whole idea of like skilled intentionality is a concept within the discipline of ecological dynamics. And intentionality, being skilled with intentionality is also highly important. So anyways, I want to throw that back over to you, Kyle, because I've been ranting for a hot minute here.
No, that's good. I think it's a fantastic overview of what we're chasing after and why we think it's so important. I would love to hear a quick synopsis of, for our audio only listeners, what is the tweet thread that we're looking at, and what is the conversation that piqued your interest?
So Steve was just commenting on one of Bobby's subsidiaries here, his app Portello. I don't even know.
Pelotoro or something like that. Yeah.
Pelotoro. Yeah. I'm not good at reading, by the way, guys. So if I butcher anybody's name, I apologize in advance. But anyway, so what was really interesting to me about this whole conversation was the fact that what I think Matt was saying in this video was that the things that had worked for him at the lower levels did not work for him once he got to pro ball. And what Steve kind of jumps in here and he says here, well, maybe I'll just read it. This is lacking some context, so bear with me, and hopefully the summary helped give this context. Steve is saying, I'm clearly hearing this wrong, but it seems to me swoop. Is it swoop?
Swopes.
How would you pronounce it?
I think it's swopes.
Swopes? Yeah. Swopes?
Yeah.
So Steve is basically, I think I'm hearing this wrong. It feels like Swopes is saying that the feels and his process led him to success in college. And then in pro ball, coaches divorced him from this self-ownership because they thought they knew best. And this muddied the waters for him and took away autonomy. And I think that's, regardless of whether or not that is true for what Matt is saying here, this I think is a true statement about coaching in general. You know, and so like for me, regardless of whether or not Steve is saying anything relevant to what Matt is saying, that point is still relevant regardless. And I think then as you start to go through the rest of it, because actually for me, it was more interesting to look at the conversation between Steve and Bobby, because two guys that I think both respect each other. And so, because the next thing that, let's see here, because one of the things that the arguments that Matt is making is that it's important to tell players what they're good at and then have them focus on that. And in some ways, I somewhat agree with that, but I don't think that's the only answer. And I think so much of like the mentality of coaching is like figuring out how to simplify things to make them digestible for hitters so that you can actually like get good at something, which I think works. It works a lot better than trying to like do too many things. But my thought process is that, and this is, I think from an ecological standpoint, is if I can get the right organizing constraint, then the rest naturally follows and it builds on one another. And so like, that's how you get coherent complexity. And that's what I'm trying to do, at least for my athletes, is like, look, I mean, the problems are pretty complex. And if I were to give you a simple answer, like that might only work a small percentage of the time. And most of the time, right, like the way that baseball thinks about things now is more in terms of probabilities. And I think that's hard for some athletes because they then adopt a strategy that in theory should work a certain percentage of the time over the long run, except for the fact that they may not get enough of a chance to get that
Yeah.
to work out in a long enough, because they won't get a big enough sample size. And so I think you have to sometimes find, I feel like it's a cop out. Like, I get it. The game is hard. And to me, the way that I've always thought about it is like these simple strategies of like double down on your strengths. I don't disagree with that. I think you should double down on them, but at some point you're going to need to have another solution, because that's
Bingo.
only going to take you so far. And
Yeah,
so,
I would jump in and say from the hitting side was talking to one of our coaches, and they identified properly last year that the intentions of the hitter, what their approach was at the plate, was not matching some of the successes that they were having. And so they helped change that. And he had a lot more success for the rest of the year. That's great. And then as I was talking about it to him, I said, oh, that's fantastic. So now you can use his superpower, see if you can't expand that superpower, what he's good at. But then, and I think it was, he was looking for plates out over the plate, but wasn't performing well in those. It's like, okay, but now you can work on that too, right? So now you have this guiding principle of what a strength is, and you can expand that strength. But now you also know, okay, so then what's his weakness? Well, can we make that weakness better so that he has more solutions? Because at some point, somebody's going to throw the ball over there, and he's going to have to be able to hit it, and he's going to have to turn the lineup over. And so I think that that's where the strength piece is good, is because it can actually guide how you build environments for your players to get better, instead of just going, no, we're, to your point, we're going to double down on this, and that's the only solution we're going to utilize. And then you put the player in a really tough situation when the situation doesn't call for that. Another good conversation with a young man today about his strength has always been his fastball changeup, and our conversation was essentially, hey, what happens, when that doesn't work, right? Like, when it works, it's great, but what happens when it doesn't work? We're not trying to give you more options so that every game you go out there and you throw them all evenly. There might be days when you do use your two best pitches and you dominate with it. What we're trying to do is to recognize that that might not always work, or the umpire's giving you a different zone, or the hitters have picked up on that, and now you need a different option so that maybe you can go back to it. But I think that's the point with opening up their toolbox, if you will, their solution toolbox is helping them have more solutions rather than just limiting them to their strengths only. And I think you point out a really good, important point there.
and I think too, you even see in professional baseball, it moving to like liking guys that can play multiple positions. And that's just a testament to it. I think, there's something to it though about specializing. Like you need depth and width, and there's only so wide you can make something before it becomes just a flat plane. So like there's a level of like, the whole like jack of all trades, master of none. I think there's some truth to that, and I think there's a balance there. And I think I think I would have to think more about that, but I do think the pendulum is swinging the other direction, and I'm not sure where it's going to end up. And I think there probably needs to be more conversation around that. I guess I'm just not prepared to go that direction, but I just see that as an affordance right now, so I wanted to speak on that. But I think to try to, one thing that's important, and maybe I'm going to put you here on the spot because I'm trying to come up with this, and the challenging thing when it comes to ecological dynamics is like, how would you describe to somebody if they were to ask you what is ecological dynamics? How would you go about telling somebody like what is it that conveys maybe some of the core concepts to a person? Because I think where the greatest misunderstanding currently around ecological dynamics is that people just think it's like, oh, you just make it game like. They think that that's what it means. So I'm curious, currently right now where you're at, how would you describe ecological dynamics to somebody?
I would add, before I answer, that also maybe within our smaller subset of the baseball community, it's just manipulating constraints.
Right.
And
yes.
a lot of times manipulating constraints divorced from the athlete environment system, that is divorced from the environment. I will liberally steal from Tyler Yerby. He was on a podcast that I sent the section screenshotted it to you guys because I just thought it was so good. Where he was asked a similar question and answered one of the best ways that I've seen. It's respecting the movement that you're seeing. It's what we talked about just previously. It's respecting that there's an athlete or an organism and there's environment, and how movement emerges is dictated by both of those things influencing one another. And ecological dynamics is likely so much more than that. But I think the thing that I appreciate about it is that it allows you to then think about, well, it's just game like. Well, no, not necessarily, right? It's not just games, so to speak. It's how skill movement emerges. And so if your games are not connecting to the same information, if your games are not helping produce solutions and new and novel ones that are like what they're going to produce in the game, then you're just playing games, right? You're having them pay attention to information that's not there. If the constraints you're setting up are completely detaching them from the environment, which at times is likely important, at least for my guys as throwers. We're not always going to be able to have a batter in. They are going to throw balls into a ply wall. There are ways that we can acknowledge that I think the game is moving forward. But I really appreciate that the athlete environment interaction, the movement that is emerging, the skill that's emerging. It's trying to respect that entire process instead of just focusing on one or the other.
And I'm going to give it a shot. I've never been able to satisfactory for myself give a good short explanation of like what is ecological dynamics. But for me, I think ecological dynamics, like Kyle was talking about, first and foremost, the unit or the level of analysis or how we look at things is at the level of the performer and the environment, and that there is a mutual reciprocal relationship in which the two are influencing each other back and forth, and that through that relationship and within that relationship and between those, the athlete and the environment, both are dynamic and changing. And because of that and through that, you have a level of non-linearity. Things don't happen in a linear way. Sometimes you have the cause and effect that's going on there is not always immediately obvious that it's like A plus B equals C, or 1 + 1 = 2. So you're like looking at it, you're like, how did that small inputs can have drastic changes, and sometimes big inputs can have minimal effect on the system and the outcome of the system. And so for me, when I'm thinking about, or to me, what ecological dynamics, if I were to describe what it is that it is like this dynamic athlete performer environment, and that an ecological approach appreciates those types of things and is trying to understand also the performer and the environment as a holistic system. So it's not in ecological dynamics, we're not trying to break things apart into their component parts, trying to understand the parts in isolation and how they work, and then trying to reassemble it back together to then we understand what the thing is. And so this kind of comes back to this idea and this concept of emergence. Things that are emergent, you can't break them into their component parts and then through the understanding of them, just like reassemble them, and then it just works the way you just took it apart or whatever. There's much more dynamic stuff that is going on. Rather, it's kind of more like an ecology of like, okay, using the example of trying to garden or whatever, like there is a level of cultivation that goes on, and it's dynamic, it's nonlinear and whatnot. So anyways, that for me is my attempt at a non-succinct answer for like what is ecological dynamics. So anyways, in the keeping with being nonlinear, to kind of loop back here to the conversation that we were having about Steve Johnson and Bobby Tewksbury kind of going back and forth and talking about because the other element too, that an ecological approach, another core concept is that with it being trying to spend, in some ways, keeping both in focus and in some ways giving equal time to both the performer and the environment, is also, we also, when it comes to coaching, have a more athlete-centered approach versus a coach-centered approach of the coach is the one dictating to the athlete how things should go, has all the answers of telling them how they should move, what they should do, all this sort of stuff. But rather, it views the coach as a facilitator, as one who facilitates development. Okay. And so some of that comes back to, and also trying to harness the power of implicit learning versus everything being explicit. Although there is room for explicitness, but what we find too, and I think most people have experienced this, being explicit with your directions or etc. doesn't always work. Like you can say, hey, I need you to move X sort of way. And then how many times does an athlete not even come close to what it is that how you're wanting them to move? And so this is where an ecological approach tends to try to, again, through being athlete-centered, tries to focus on, okay, where's the athlete currently, trying to understand that, and how to help facilitate them acquiring more skill with where they're at. And part of that also, what that looks like to be athlete-centered is via co-design. And so I know that Steve Johnson is not super familiar with ecological dynamics, but here again is just, in some ways, what ecological dynamics does is gives language and a broader framework for good practices that most coaches have always done. But now it helps you systematize things and also filter out, in my opinion, things that are contradictory practices that don't really synergize well together. And so in a way, it helps you kind of sift through your own system and help refine your system so that you can do more of the good things that have always gotten results. Because I also think, in general, the Pareto principle of the 80-20 rule, that 20% of what you do gets you 80% of the results. And then 80% of what you do probably makes up the rest of the 20, which means more than likely, since it's a very large amount of stuff, that a lot of that stuff has very minimal effect, because more than likely too, the 80-20 rule also applies to that other 80%. So then, 20% of that 80 is making up, that other 20%. So anyways, at least to me, that seems to be what's going on there. So what that means is that there's a lot of stuff that you're doing that just is not very bang for its buck or has minimal effectiveness. And so to me, if you want to, because, right, if you're a good coach and you've had success, sustaining success is much harder than, it becomes a very difficult task, to maintain where you're at. I mean, and so to me, you kind of in some ways need to constantly be refining your craft in order to maintain success. And so anyways, I think as we begin to see here, so I want to keep going with what Steve was talking about here, or rather Bobby chimes in and says, can we start here? Do you agree coaches help players with their self-discovery process? And I think that was a great question from Bobby. And Steve's response was, yes, I believe coaches can create collaborative environments that can help players, but I also believe they can harm players just as easily. And I'm kind of curious your thoughts, Kyle, on what he's saying there, because I would have to ask Steve specifically, but I'm kind of curious what Steve means there. And I think we just have to read between the lines. And in some ways, I might be reading into what is being said there, my own bias, but that's all we really have to go on. And Steve can correct it later. So I'm curious what your thoughts are on this part here.
What I lack clarity on is if the collaborative environment that's being created is also what he's referencing after the but statement. So yes, I believe coaches can create collaborative environments that can help players. That alone is, I think we all, particularly from the ecological standpoint, agree with that. The question is, but I also believe they can harm players just as easily. My sense when I read that is that he wouldn't have written collaborative environments again, but I don't think, maybe I'm giving him the benefit of the doubt, I don't think that that's what he's referencing after the but statement, right? Like, I read it as, I believe that coaches can create these collaborative environments, but I also believe that they don't do that very often, and so they can harm players just as easily. But again, also reading my own situations into it, I don't know whether or not that collaborative environment he's meaning to be on both sides of the but word there.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that's what's kind of interesting about his question and thought-provoking, because, initially I wanted to read it as, to your point of like, okay, coaches, if they want to do top-down and not be collaborative, they can just as easily harm players as they can help them. And we've all seen it where we've given, myself included, going in a traditional approach, or even sometimes trying to be ecological, because you have to sometimes give people some feedback or some place to start. And the feedback or thing that you say to an athlete sometimes doesn't help them. I mean, I don't know how many times like I suggest something to an athlete and it just doesn't work, and I remember, and I appreciate Donnie Ecker has been a big influence on my career, getting me to kind of branch out, because I got to meet him when he was working out in Wisconsin, and he kind of changed the trajectory of my career with a simple question of like, hey, you want to come work for us? And I was like, huh? But anyway, so where I'm going with this is that one of the things that I've heard Donnie say is like, he'll suggest something to a player, he'll try it and it won't go well. And he's like, let's never do that again. And like, you have to be open and willing to move on from your little pet thing. Like, and I think this is the thing of like having a level of humility when it comes to coaching. Like, it requires a lot if you truly want to help your players. It requires just a high degree of humility, because it's just hard. Because I mean, Steve's big thing that you watch and follow some of the other stuff, he's just like, everybody's guessing. Everybody's guessing. And so if that's the case, then it becomes the question of like, who's got the best system for finding and converging on the thing that's going to help your athletes. And it's going to be a mix. And this is why the whole purpose of this podcast is like, ecological dynamics and analytics, right? Analytics being a way of quantifying and like collecting data and utilizing data to help converge. It's not a only analytics. It's a both and. And I think the ecological part helps, and because another key core concept is aliveness, right? We're dealing with biological beings, and that changes the dynamics. We're not working with computers. I think one of the worst things that has hurt, or maybe not worse, but it's really hurt our ability to connect with athletes, is thinking about the body and the brain and the systems of the human body as being mechanical. Like that the brain is a computer and a machine, and you're like all this sort of stuff. Even biomechanics like starts thinking about, and I think it comes back to like our culture, oh, why do we want to follow analytics? Because of science. Because if we have the numbers, then we can be always right. That's kind of the idea. Or we can start to control our environment. And there's some level of truth, I think, to like learning how to control the environment, but rather I think it's more like learning to surf. You don't control the wave, you learn how to ride the wave. And I think that's more what ecological dynamics is about. And also going back to the point that I was actually trying to make though with the machine piece is like, we're not machines, we're biological beings. And biological beings, although they have some sort of, you could say, kind of straightforward linear processes, as far as like, okay, you apply stress to the system and the system adapts to that stress, or how we build muscles, like, in different things with different sort of systems, they have more of a linear path. But the question is rather how, when you start having all these different systems start interacting with each other, things become a little bit more complex. And that's where dynamic systems theory is akin to complexity theory. And so this is where and also systems thinking is also involved in what is ecological dynamics. And so all these things start to come into play here. And then when we're going back to like, this is why we can just easily harm players with our suggestions, because things are so complex. And to think that it's super simple. And so maybe that's what he's talking about here. The one last piece before you jump in is that the other thing when it comes to ecological dynamics is it does require a level of skill. I won't say necessarily a high level of skill. I do think it's relatively high, but I mean, I see other people who, and I'm not saying they're not smart or not skilled either, and just like they don't have like a deep, in-depth understanding of ecological dynamics, but yet they can take some of these principles and and apply them very well. And so where I'm going that is like, I think going back to the other point I was trying to make is that our Western mindset seeks perfection and wants things to, we have in America this tendency to search for silver bullets. We just want to take a pill, a magic pill, whatever, this sort of thing, and make it like, and just have this thing like apply and work all the time. And, and so I think that's why we have defaulted towards these sort of structures of rigid control and like the mechanics, because we want to feel like and know that, well, this is going to work. And so for me, that's where things can sometimes work and sometimes, it can be harmful. And I see that as being the challenge that we're really having to fight against here.
I think you underscored something that's probably my favorite thing about ecological dynamics, and that is that if you're striving to be more ecological in your coaching, you can almost not fail when you're designing practice. That, like, with my old traditional coaching, if I instituted something and we didn't get it right, I felt like we failed. And a lot of times I was seeking for the thing that I wanted to see produced. And therefore, if that didn't happen, then the practice was a failure because the solution that I wanted didn't emerge. Whereas with ecological dynamics, for example, today, to what you talked about, young man was throwing a bullpen. He had been trying to create different shapes with his slider, and I just wanted to toy with a sweeper, a pitch that uses seam effects. So I put it in his hand, but I set the intentions, and I said, hey, I'd like to just try some things here. When we do things like this, we're not looking to change pitches. We're just looking to search a little bit and see what happens and see what we can learn. And I've really appreciated that because I'm just essentially trying to help them search the potential solution space or a pitch, for example, that they might then be able to go test and run with and see in the live gameplay to see if it helps out their repertoire. And so we threw a few, and we were able to just see why the seam effects helped him get a more horizontally moving pitch. And we talked about when might that use? Okay, maybe you just start throwing it in catch. Like, we don't need to throw it in a game right away. Maybe we could use it in live. Maybe you see an opening, a situation where a guy fouls off your other breaking balls and you need to run one a little bit different. And this could be an option if you just keep it in your toolbox. And that's the thing that I love about ecological dynamics, is that even if we would have done that activity and it didn't work at all, it was still a good practice, because he sort of, by that failing, he's going to learn, oh, that's interesting. That didn't work for me. So in order for me to create a different shape or do something different, like, I would have to do something different. And so that's been really freeing for me as a coach. We've had a couple guys who, to your point, when we're talking about co-design and our desire to control as coaches, who basically took my initial thoughts on certain pitches that we were trying to create because they were having trouble in the games getting hitters out, and they changed them without telling me, and they're better pitches now, and they're doing the things that we were looking for them to do. And I feel more proud of that rather than less as a coach, because that's actually what I'm looking for. Is I'm looking for that ownership from the athlete, for it to be a co-designed thing. And if I can take any credit, it's just that I started the search process for them, and then they continued it, and they have now found a pitch that is helping them get more guys out in their very next outing. And that's what's really exciting for me as a coach, is that I don't have to have all the answers. And it's to your point earlier, I can just be good at asking questions, helping the search process. And that's why ecological dynamics, regardless of all the language, is approachable for anybody, because it really is just about being present in the environment and helping the athlete find the solution by connecting to the environment. And I love that, setting up problems for them to solve instead of giving them the answers. I can't tell you how often I feel overwhelmed when I don't have an answer, but then it's like, well, what if I just start setting up problems for them to solve? I'm going to make them a better problem solver, which is the very thing we're looking to do.
Right. And one of the things that you touched on there is like, I do think it's that whole thing of like coaches feeling like they need to produce results. And then in order to do that, they need to show that they're on their way, because I think it comes back to like corporate America, right? Like, okay, how is what you're doing, affecting the bottom line? How are we making progress towards this? And so when you see failure, guys not hitting balls, doing this and that, all sort of stuff, and it looks ugly, you're sitting there going, oh, everybody is sitting there asking like, okay, is this really making progress towards our end goal? And I think that's where, again, like ecological dynamics, I think is hard for people because of this whole special concept that it basically says is like, look, this is nonlinear. You're going to have days that are going to look bad. There might be several of those days or whatever, but that's part of the process. And I do think there are ways to mitigate that, because I definitely struggle with this, and I've struggled with this on some days. And like it, because there's another thread that I think is really important. And this was something that I really appreciated when I got a chance to actually work. So when I met Donnie Ecker, it was actually in the context of going out to observe Ryan Parker work with hitters. And at that time, Ryan Parker and Donnie were working together. And then I had a chance to work with Parker later on. And his big thing was actually thinking about things from a video game design. And so I don't want to get too much off into the weeds there, but that's another component of like, how do we actually engage an athlete and whatnot? And so before I get over to that, I do want to, because it is tied into this idea of self-discovery and this whole thing of like ownership, taking away autonomy and all this sort of stuff. Like these are key components, because video games, when you start thinking about video games and play, like because at the end of the day, I understand that like, okay, people have turned this into a career. Playing a game has turned into a career for people, and there's more riding on it than just playing a game. But at the end of the day, what inevitably made these people play the game was for the love of the game. You know what I mean? And so like, I think what is being said here and communicated here is like how, again, like, I think for me, an ecological approach really helps keep things synergistic, allowing things to work synergistic. One, the reason is that these ideas and concepts are baked into ecological dynamics. Play, although it's not a tenet of it, it is the natural outworking of these ideas and concepts. And so this is where like all this stuff starts to get tied together of like self-discovery and the importance of that. And so just to kind of, continue on this conversation here. So like one of the next things that Bobby says, so basically, Steve, are you saying that like, okay, in one scenario, the coach declares the way that is right. And then in the other scenario, the coach helps a player feel things and study historical data to collaboratively understand the player's individual scenario. Suggestions are suggestions are uncovered, not declared. And I think this is where like, even though I think, Bobby and I have sometimes gone back and forth, and then actually, too, by the way, at some point, maybe there's an unreleased episode that me and Bobby had recorded a while back. We'll see whether or not that ever sees the light of day. Because I was really quite tired that day, and I was a little frustrated at my lack of ability to articulate things. Although I don't know if it's quite as bad as I had feared. But anyways, and there's also a controversy that had prompted that conversation. So I'll have to check with the person that we're trying to actually have on to be a part of that discussion as to whether or not that gets released. But anyways, I say all that to say is that sometimes me and Bobby have, at times, gone back and forth a little bit at odds. But the thing is, when I look at Bobby's stuff, like we're so close on so many things. I mean, this whole idea, like things like, I think he's coming around more and more to this, because he tweeted out the other day, like screw all your game, like, environments and whatever, intent is the only thing that matters. And then we kind of came back and said, I'm like, look, man, we're not against intent. Like, that's a huge piece of like having things be game like this. All works together synergistically. And I think, like, when I look at this conversation, I feel like he's not being antagonistic here. Like, I think, and even his language is starting to change. I don't know what his personal opinions are, but the mere fact of like how he's conversating, to me, just makes me feel like we're progressing the conversation. And so, because even the things that is being said here, I think he's really spot on this idea of like within an ecological approach. And I'm not saying that Steve is conscientiously doing an ecological approach or whatever, but his ideas are very ecological friendly. But even here, like with what we're talking about, to me, this language of suggestions and the way that the coach is interacting with the player, and also the player's own personal experience, is uncovered, or it is revealed through the process. It is not something that is predetermined and comes in as being said.
Yes. Yeah, that's, again, super freeing as a coach. Also, we can acknowledge too, can be super overwhelming, because as you said, 10 minutes ago, like it feels like that idea of control, right, is a huge piece. It's a huge piece for us as human beings, our desire to control things. It's a huge piece for us as coaches. And so even though that's has become very freeing for me, it's not freeing all the time. It can feel really overwhelming when we are searching for a solution with a young man and we're not finding it, and we're having the same problems and he's not having the success that we want. So want to acknowledge that as well. But I think that underscores that you are not the one who will ultimately probably come up with the answer. It is the player, and it is your guiding intention as a coach to continue to try to set up environments that will help that emerge. And that certainly doesn't mean that you won't, at times I will absolutely show, hey, why don't we try this grip? And then they'll go from there, right? And they'll toy with it. Well, you can mess with your thumb, you can do this with your finger. And we could see if we could create different shapes that then they could go test in the game-like environment. And so I do also want to underscore and acknowledge that it can feel really overwhelming, because you're going to enter in and it's a little bit like walking into the cereal aisle where you have 150 different cereals and you're not sure where to start. And so I think sometimes that can be difficult as well, which is where sometimes some of these systems, I do think that they get too narrow, but they can help give you a guiding framework to start on and then maybe hopefully graduate from. But I do appreciate some of those things as well. It's just, let's hopefully not get drunk on the system, right? So that now I'm applying that to everybody, or I think that's ultimately my biggest maybe gripe, if that's the right word, with many of these systems that assess players, is the reason that they're around is that they say, hey, there's not one right way to move, right? And there's not one right mechanics. So we're going to assess you so that we can find your one right way. And inadvertently, they become the very thing that they were criticizing, that, they become the thing that they were trying to get away from, which is there's one right way to move. Well, and I think that's what ecological dynamics is trying to acknowledge, is that there's one right way to move for the situation at hand, and it's probably going to be different based on the problem they're trying to solve.
Well, and two, Okay, so now is a good time to go towards kind of like my thoughts around like just using motor preferences as an example. This is not necessarily just to be a full attack on it or anything like that. It's just more of a thing of like using their information as an example. Okay, so with this, so finding your preferred way of moving or whatever. Okay, that's an attractor state. Like ecological dynamics, okay, from dynamic systems theory, we have this idea and these concepts from dynamic systems theory of like there are states that the system likes to be in, and those are called attractors. And they're basically, the way you can think about it is like, right, I'm trying to groove something. So there's certain grooves within a motor landscape that the system has a tendency toward. Okay, and the deeper these grooves are, the more stable the system is. But that might not actually be ideal, because if the system is really, really stable and the amount of solutions that it can cover is not very wide, then you basically become a one-trick pony of like, okay, so you practice on, for it, let's take this example, right? You practice on hitting the ball down the middle. So every pitch that you see, you work on is right down the middle. Okay, so then your swing only works for right down the middle. Your ability to adjust outside of that, generally speaking, does not become very good. It's the same thing if you face the same velocity all the time, right? Like there have been in the book, The Talent Code, okay, they're talking about myelin and all this sort of stuff. And I can't remember if it was in this book necessarily. But anyways, there's this example of like somebody wanted to learn how to play like a very difficult piece of on the piano, and there's this really difficult part. So this person practiced it over and 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 over again, myelinated the whole thing, so that whenever she went to the piano, her fingers would automatically curl up in that way to interact with the piano. She could not do anything else. She had to basically unlearn that whole process. And so what that actually demonstrates is that she created a very, very deep attractor well, so that as soon as she got in that context, her system automatically went that direction. And quite honestly, in my opinion, ecological dynamics has shown me that the ideas and the thoughts that are put forward in the talent code, for by and large, not all of them, but a lot of them, are actually not good for high performance. Because one of the ideas they was talking about is like, the idea is that they wanted to set stuff up so that the athlete basically automatically would start doing what they were quote unquote cued to do. Based upon a few cues, automatically they'd go into running this formation and it just became automatic. Now there's something to that, but we don't actually want that level of automaticity. We actually want to connect to the information that is in the environment, to be highly sensitive to it. And there's this other idea of online perspective control. So as it develops, I am constantly adjusting in real time to what is currently happening. Not like, oh, okay, because this is how you get, in a way, like if I'm thinking about like in terms of football, trying to avoid it or trying to get around a defender, get juked, right? Like this is how you get juked, and like you miss a tackle because you assumed you kind of were programmed to like, oh, I automatically, when this happens, I automatically do this. And it's actually not connected to actually what's happening. And so this is where I think what the system is looking at motor preferences is really just attractor states. And there's this assumption that an attractor state is automatically good. And I think that is that is not necessarily the case. It's actually really good to understand the current state of the system, because that sets up what the system can currently do. And so these things, like, and that's why I think it works somewhat. Like that's why they see some results like this, and so I'm not saying that you can't see results from things, but the question becomes, okay, long term, what are the long-term consequences of this? And so one of the things that, generally speaking, within the research and the literature of ecological dynamics, is that over the long term, what they tend to see is when you have more variable play and all this sort of stuff, and through the different ways that an ecological dynamics approach advocates training athletes or developing skill, you will see more failure early on. It'll seem less sticky, but over the long term, it actually sticks more and is more resilient to decay. And so what I'm starting to see, and this has been my personal experience, and granted, I'm only in a 2-year program, so my guys generally stay around 2 years. If they have a bad first year, meaning in school, we might get to keep them for 3. But in general, guys are around for 2 years. And what I've noticed is it takes some guys about a year and a half. So basically, their full freshman year, and then halfway through the year going into spring is when, and once we get into kind of the early part of their sophomore spring is where I see a lot of change. And it sometimes takes guys that long. And so I think we have to understand, because this is true of okay, let's say somebody comes to me and they want to get strong. They want to lift 315. Well, if they only lift right now, 95 pounds, you ain't getting a 315 next week. And I think that's kind of the thing, or even probably in the next 3 months. It takes a lot longer. There's a certain time window to expect that we know through training athletes over and over again, how long it takes to develop certain types of qualities, strength, speed, all these sort of things. And some of the things that are generally needed in order to confidently see certain types of gains. And so that's the same thing is true of skill. And I think a lot of people are just looking for that quick fix, go to the pitching coach to get, this little mechanical fix or cue that's going to change or absolutely take my game to the next level. And quite honestly, we've talked about this here on this podcast of the whole idea of the novelty or Hawthorne effect of yeah, that can help move you forward. But that in and of itself is not, you're constantly then just looking for this little, again, going back to that whole idea of mechanical fix. I forget the language that people have used in the past of just constantly having to go back to your swing coach for the next little thing. And for me, my goal is to teach them how to be their own coach. And I'm only there to help them when the puzzle is a little bit too complicated for them in the moment, or they're losing the forest through the trees. And I'm there to give them perspective and to come alongside them and help them navigate when they need help. And so that's kind of in some ways, I am in some ways trying to make myself obsolete. That's what makes this too, I think, hard for some coaches is they see it as a threat to their business model.
That makes sense. Yeah. I mean, you acknowledged an important point that kind of closes out. I appreciated at the end of that tweet thread there, Bobby's, his field-based approach, which worked in college, didn't stand up at the next level that he was playing at. Ultimately, a field-based process that relies on tons and tons of reps to feel right is fragile. Mm-hmm. Having a framework of reliable personal data that removes doubt and promotes routine is powerful. And I appreciate that. I think that's a good thought. But I do think that when you are trying to bucket or help focus guys on certain things, your question was very good. Will that thing work long term? And there's a good chance that when you're bucketing a guy and when you're saying this is what makes him good, that you are removing his ability to adapt to the environment as it is. That you are, even in the best of intentions that we have, we make him really good. And that's, that could be where you start to look at the player's own goals and aspirations, right? Do they want to play at the next level at where you're currently at? Then, but even sort of the point of the tweet at the end, I think he was trying to clarify what Matt was saying, and I appreciated that. And yet it also underscores that guiding principle that you give to the athlete. It has to be adaptable, because when they start running into problems that they can't solve or have bigger challenges to solve, they need to be able to be adaptable in order to solve new problems. Because that I think baseball is, and maybe I'm just not connected enough to other games as well, but every game is kind of constantly adjusting between offense and defense. But man, pitching certainly has seen that. You've seen the different types of pitches and how hitters then respond to that, and then pitchers respond back and forth, and you're seeing these waves going on. And so if you can get ahead of those waves and constantly be a good problem solver, I think that it especially for hitters is going to be what you said. It's going to be a longer term learning to solve problems. I confess, sometimes as a pitching coach, it's a little easier because you can see you are dictating a lot of what's going on. So sometimes you can create a new shape and see success right away that helps your other pitches much better. But there is a long-termness of this as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think to kind of wrap on kind of that whole thing of like, to me, an ecological approach, the theory and the framework sets you up in such a way to help you think about long-term. I mean, because a lot of it was developed around one, children, like the development of children and how children develop. And so that has a long-term aspect to it. And the other part of it, I think, is like long-term child development and physical education. And so a lot of these ideas and concepts are set up or thinking long-term in terms of the development of a person. And so that's where, for me, I think the power of an ecological approach is that it has all the, you could say, ingredients in some ways, and it gives you a lens to begin to see and assess and to understand things in a way that's going to, I think, in a way, set you up for successive success, that things start to grow and compound over time. And so for me, that's what's been so appealing, is that, man, this is the thing that I was always looking for, is like, I wanted something that was functional and transferable, where we had the transfer of training, and then also and then the third piece is like also described reality. And I think there are some elements where an ecological approach can grow on the description of reality. I think there are some elements that may need to be adjusted, but that's such a small component of it. I think a lot of this stuff really describes reality so much better than some of the other approaches. Like I was talking about, like some of it's just like the whole like processing approach, which sees the body as like a computer, and it's like, we're not a computer. So like, to me, that's got a flaw in its own logic. And so, or an assumption, like a flawed assumption that's built right into it, whereas an ecological approach doesn't. And so that's where I see that it has an edge there. And so this is where, I'd highly encourage people to keep looking into that stuff. I think we're going to kind of land the plane on here. I think at some point, though, in the future, I do want to kind of talk about video games. We're kind of alluding to it, but I think that we're going to leave it on a cliffhanger here. And that can be a topic for next time. But you got any closing thoughts, Kyle, before we jump out here?
I look forward, because I did run into your video game. I think it was Like or Repost, and I went through it. It was fantastic. So I look forward to doing that.
Analyzing.